Welcome to Craftlit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 573, The Disadvantages of Being a Gentleman. This episode of Craftlit is brought to you by you. Thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I am well. I am very well because this is the last week I should have to live with such a hectic schedule, and I will be able to go back to doing real good research for all y'all. But this week, not so much. This is our last push. Let's see, we should be done with everything by next Friday. And then we stop doing the training and start doing the quality assurance work and the retraining to get rid of bad habits that people have acquired over time. And I'm looking forward to that because this training schedule has been really hectic. That said, I am still walking across the Delaware River, except when it's raining. See, when it's raining and breezy, I decided not to go on the bridge, is what I did. Instead, I have a little under the desk cycle pedal thingy, Mabar, which lets me at least keep my blood pumping, which is good. You know, 'cause I'm not getting any younger or anything like that. But I am got real excited about two movies. I didn't mention one of them when we first saw it. It was a little while ago. It was the first movie that we went back to see in a theater, courtesy of Thing 2. He insisted, and he was right. And that was ShangChi, the latest, and the 5 gold rings or circles or something. Doesn't matter. ShangChi is all I care about because he is awesome. It's the latest Marvel movie. It's so good. Michelle Yeoh, who was in Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon and was so spectacular in Crazy Rich Asians, she shows up in ShangChi as well. It's lovely. It's got lovely relationships in it. It has marvelous people. It has some of the most amazing fight choreography I believe I have ever seen. And I don't know if you've come across it before, but on the YouTubes, the UBTubies, Vanity Fair publishes these breakdowns where they have a director come on and talk you through with screen captures and one of those like John Madden pens that you can draw on the screen with. They have them go through a scene, one of their favorite scenes in a movie that they've made. And the director of ShangChi goes through the bus fight scene. Now, if you've seen the movie, then you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't seen the movie, let me sum up. Imagine an articulated bus that would be a bus that has 2 buses put together with a little accordion section. So an articulated bus careening through San Francisco, the hilliest town that I know of. Well, certainly the hilliest town that I've driven in the United States. It's probably not the hilliest anywhere, but it's really hilly and it's old. And so the streets are narrower than they might be elsewhere. And the buildings are old and they don't move. And it's exciting. It looks so good. And when you hear his breakdown of how he did it, your jaw will drop. Mine certainly did, several times, actually. I think I also emitted several "no way" comments while I was watching it. So that was a lot of fun. Fun, but also really heartwarming. It really was a very heartwarming story. And I got to give him a lot of credit. Awkwafina, she's a comedian. She's an actress. You've seen her, I guess I'm supposed to say actor. I think of it as a badge of pride. But she's an actor who was in Crazy Rich Asians and also in the Oceans movie that Sandra Bullock did, which was really a lot of fun as well. Awkwafina is hilarious and extremely talented. And I think she's also got a TV show on. Anyway, girl works a lot. She is in Shang-Chi, and unlike what usually happens to women sidekicks, and I'm putting air quotes around that, unlike what usually happens to female sidekicks in action films, she holds her own. I mean, she doesn't do any of the hardcore martial arts fighting. That's left to a different woman. So it's not like chicks got squeezed out all the way around. She doesn't get lost. She doesn't die. She is set up for a sequel with Shang-Chi, and I cannot wait. So that was awesome. And then, as if that weren't excitement enough, go to a movie theater, we're wearing our masks, we're being good, there's nobody in the theater except us, and then there are two other people who are 10 rows behind us. So that felt pretty good. Then we decide to go see Dune. And we decide to drive into Philly to go see Dune with Aaron, because he is working now at the Reading Terminal Market, which is right around the corner from Jefferson Station, where there's this giant AMC on the top floor that has an IMAX screen. I heard Denis Villeneuve talk about why he chose IMAX, and I thought it was a weird choice. But I'll tell you what he said before I tell you what I thought about the movie. He said that he had chosen IMAX, which has a 4:3 ratio. It's like if you printed out photographs from a point-and-shoot camera in the 90s. It's that dimension, basically. It is not letterbox. It is not the long, thin, epic Lawrence of Arabia Cinerama Dome vision thing. It's really kind of narrow and boxy and something that you could have watched on a television set 20 years ago. And he did it for two reasons. One, the quality of the picture that you can get using an IMAX setup, a camera setup, is excellent. And he wanted to film with real lighting as much as possible. He also wanted to film with real sets as much as possible. So there is very little green screen in Dune, which is all the more impressive. When you see it, your eyes will bug out of your head. He also said that because of the IMAX format, it meant that when he did more intimate scenes, family scenes between Paul and his mother Jessica, or between Jessica and her husband Leto, the way the camera works with people up close creates this very intimate relationship between you and the film, partially because it is so big on an IMAX screen, but because of the way the camera captures their faces. I don't understand enough about it to be able to explain it better than that. There are many interviews with him where he is talking all about the choices and everything. The big thing is he made it in IMAX not to make it big, imposing, and distant. He made it in IMAX because he could jump from big and imposing sandworms down to very, very quiet moments. So we saw it with Aaron. We were ecstatic. Go see it in any theater that has the best sound system you can get access to, because the sound wasn't loud. The sound was mixed. It was like smell-o-vision. It made you feel like you were there. It's like they had subwoofers underneath our seats. When one of the transport ships landed, our seats were vibrating so much, I looked down at my bottle of water and it looked like the Jurassic Park scene when, the dinosaur is supposed to be hunting them. And every time there's a footstep, it makes the water shake. It was like that in the theater, but it wasn't loud. I never felt like I needed to plug my ears. It's just mixed really well. It's scored beautifully. Hans Zimmer did the music, and it's beautiful. The cast is spectacular. The film is beautiful. It's so worth going to see. If you've read the book Dune, you will love. I don't see how you could do anything other than love the movie, because Timothée Chalamet, oh my gosh, this kid is so goofy and funny and fun when he's interviewed, and he is so Paul when he is on the screen. And Oscar Isaacs as Duke Leto, spectacular. And this woman who plays Jessica, who she didn't come out of nowhere. She's been in a bunch of Mission Impossible movies. She was in The Girl on the Train. She's done tons of stuff. but she has one of those faces that kind of morphs, and so you don't always recognize that it's her. She's extraordinary. And then I have to switch tracks because it was such a good movie, and Thing 2 was not able to go with us when we went down to Philly. He had a different birthday party that he had to go to. We came home. He was heartbroken to have heard that the movie was as good as we'd all hoped it would be, and we decided just to go see it again with him at a different theater up here closer to home. So I actually saw it 2 nights in a row, and I would go back this weekend and watch it again. That is how good it is. That is how much there is to see. And at one point, the reason why I thought about him as soon as I mentioned the woman playing Jessica, he looked at me at one point and said, "She is not wearing any makeup. She has not worn any makeup this entire time." And I always think, well, it's probably just that, the way that they're doing the makeup is just natural toned and things. But he's right. You can see her freckles the entire time. They might put mascara on her in one scene, but basically she's just gorgeous and tough and occasionally terrifying. And it's wonderful because that's exactly how she should be. But then there was another moment where Aiden turned to me and said, "Oh my God, Mom, this movie is about a functional family. They're like a happy family. They all love each other. They're just in this really awkward, dangerous now position, but they're fine." And he's right. I mean, as weird as the setup for the movie is and the book is, it is 3 people at the core who really, really love each other and get along well. And they are surrounded by trusted and loyal people who also they love and who also they get along with really, really well. Jason Momoa is spectacular. He was the Call from Game of Thrones, if you watch that. Anyway, I am waxing way more than rhapsodic. It was a beautiful, beautiful film. Rebecca Ferguson, that's her name. That's the name of the actress who played Lady Jessica. Stupendous. Just stupendous. And honestly, if all you can do is watch it on television, my feeling is fine. Watch it on television, and as soon as you feel like you can get to a theater, it's going to be playing for a little while. Then you can go get to a theater. But I don't think watching it on television is going to spoil it for you. Because like I said, I watched it twice in a row, 2 nights in a row. I honestly will probably watch it again with Thing 2 this weekend on the television. No joke. So, aside from the fabulous book that we're working on, there's that. 2 really lovely films. Both of them have their actiony moments. Both of them have their shooting loud kind of moments. But they also have a lot of, they got a lot of heart, is what I'm saying. There's a lot of heart in these movies. And it comes across. And right now, I think having a lot of heart is pretty necessary and healthy. So, that being said, let's talk about the Leavenworth case, because this is going to be a long episode. We've got long chapters for you today. The first one is not long, but it's short enough that I wanted to give you a second chapter, and the second chapter is long, but it's really good. So, things to know. Number 1, rheumatism. What is it? I'm so glad you asked, because I've been wondering about this for as long as I can remember, because rheumatism comes up in old books, and I've been reading old books for as long as I can remember as well. So here's what I've learned. Arthritis, I know I mentioned rheumatism. Why am I talking about arthritis? Arthritis comes from the Greek word that means disease of the joints. So it's either a chronic or acute inflammation of joints. So it could be suddenly hurting you, or it could be constantly hurting you. Sometimes the inflammation leads to structural damage that's permanent, and then pretty much constant pain. Now, rheumatism is a general term that people used to use to describe, in general, sore, achy joints or syndromes, things like arthritis. So arthritis is more like medical terminology, and rheumatism is old school generalized terminology. However, There are things like rheumatoid arthritis. So, why is that called rheumatoid? And the answer is I don't read enough scientific medical journals to be able to tell you that. But I know we have medical people who listen, who I bet are going to be able to call in area code 206-350-1642 to tell us why there is arthritis, this word rheumatism that we really don't use anymore, and yet there is rheumatoid arthritis. I do have one guess, and that is this. There is the Greek root that rheuma or rheumat, which ends in a T, that root has a relationship to fluctuations. So my guess is that there is some kind of at root fluctuation in how the arthritis is behaving in the body. So it's not so much constant arthritic pain as it is fluctuating. This is my guess. We'll find out if I'm correct. We'll find out just how wrong I am. I'm willing to go out on that branch for you because it's fun to find out just how wrong Heather can be every once in a while. I've been feeling like that at work a little bit this week. It's been, all of us have, because things keep changing underneath us. It's funny how viruses, mutate and things change, and data comes in and makes you change things again. You will hear a reference in the book today to a reward. This crops up several times. I have been trying to find out, I am still looking, I've been trying to find out if it was possible that in 1880s New York City, if police officers, police detectives were allowed to collect rewards that had been put out for catching criminals. Apparently, according to this book, if I am reading this correctly, it was possible. This is also a time when there was plenty of corruption in the police department in New York City. So I don't know if it's a part of that or if this was just, no, this is just the way it was. And I'm slowly combing through a lot of police histories of New York City. And so far I haven't been able to find anything, but I'm still looking. So I just wanted you to know you're going to hear another reference to a reward. You will hear a reference to mucilage. I am going to link you to a page about mucilage bottles. It was a gummy goo. We still had this when I was a child. You could get mucilage bottles that had red rubber caps with a slit in them, and you turn the bottle over, and then you kind of smear this goo. It worked fine as glue temporarily, but I think everything I ever glued with mucilage within a year had dissociated from its original placement. But it was better than nothing back then. So that's what that is when you hear a reference to a bottle of mucilage. It's glue from the time appropriate glue. You will also hear a reference to F. It's a town, and you'll hear a reference to R, which is a famous watering place. Near as I can tell so far, R is for Rye, New York, Rye. Rye still is a playground. There is Rye Playground now, which is an amusement park. But prior to it being an amusement park, it was a quote-unquote watering place. It was where nice New York families would go to spend time at the beach. I think there still is at least part of an enormous hotel that was on the water. And of course, they had the little bathing pavilions and all of the different ways you could get out into the water safely without, God forbid, somebody seeing an ankle. It was lovely. It still is. There is a place called F that is being referred to as being within 20 miles of Rye, also in New York. Honestly, that puts Croton-on-Hudson within range of whatever this mysterious F is. I continue to look. I have not found anything particularly likely yet. There was one maybe that was actually across the border in Connecticut, but they're still talking about New York. And they don't talk about crossing the Hudson, which would have made it easier to figure out where she's talking about. But the more important one is R. And R, I'm fairly certain, is Rye, New York. And that's all I'm going to say until we get to the end of the chapters. So here we go, listening to chapters 21 and 22 of The Leavenworth Case, written by Anna Catherine Green, read for us by Kevin Green. Here we go.
Chapter 21. A Prejudice. True, I talk of dreams which are the children of an idle brain begot of nothing but vain fantasy. Romeo and Juliet. For one moment I sat a prey to superstitious horror, then my natural incredulity asserting itself, I looked up and remarked, "You say that all this took place the night previous to the actual occurrence?" He bowed his head. "For a warning," he declared. "But you did not seem to take it as such." "No, I am subject to horrible dreams. I thought but little of it in a superstitious way till I looked next day upon Mr. Leavenworth's dead body." "I do not wonder you behaved strangely at the inquest." "Ah, sir," he returned, with a slow, sad smile, "no one knows what I suffered in my endeavors not to tell more than I actually knew, irrespective of my dream, of this murder and the manner of its accomplishment." "You believe, then, that your dream foreshadowed the manner of the murder as well as the fact?" "I do." "It is a pity it did not go a little further, then, and tell us how the assassin escaped from, if not how he entered, a house so securely fastened." His face flushed. "That would have been convenient," he repeated. "Also, if I had been informed where Hannah was, and why a stranger and a gentleman should have stooped to the committal of such a crime." Seeing that he was nettled, I dropped my bantering vein. "Why do you say a stranger?" I asked. "Are you so well acquainted with all who visit that house as to be able to say who are and who are not strangers to the family?" "I am well acquainted with the faces of their friends, and Henry Clavering is not amongst the number. But—" "Were you ever with Mr. Leavenworth," I interrupted, "when he has been away from home, in the country, for instance, or upon his travels?" "No." But the negative came with some constraint. "Yet I suppose he was in the habit of absenting himself from home?" "Certainly." "Can you tell me where he was last July, he and the ladies?" "Yes, sir. They went to R , the famous watering place. You know." "Ah!" he cried, seeing a change in my face. "Do you think he could have met them there?" I looked at him for a moment, then rising in my turn stood level with him and exclaimed, "You are keeping something back, Mr. Harwell. You have more knowledge of this man than you have hitherto given me to understand. What is it?" He seemed astonished at my penetration, but replied, "I know no more of the man than I have already informed you, but—" and a burning flush crossed his face. "If you are determined to pursue this matter—" and he paused, with an inquiring look. "I am resolved to find out all I can about Henry Clavering," was my decided answer. "Then," said he, "I can tell you this much. Henry Clavering wrote a letter to Mr. Leavenworth a few days before the murder, which I have some reason to believe produced a marked effect upon the household." And folding his arms, the secretary stood quietly awaiting my next question. "How do you know?" I asked. "I opened it by mistake. I was in the habit of reading Mr. Leavenworth's business letters, and this, being from one unaccustomed to write to him, lacked the mark which usually distinguished those of a private nature." "And you saw the name of Clavering?" "I did. Henry Ritchie Clavering." "Did you read the letter?" I was trembling now. The secretary did not reply. "Mr. Harwell," I reiterated, "this is no time for false delicacy. Did you read that letter?" "I did, but hastily, and with an agitated conscience." "You can, however, recall its general drift?" "It was some complaint in regard to the treatment received by him at the hand of one of Mr. Leavenworth's nieces. I remember nothing more." "Which niece?" "There were no names mentioned." "But you inferred—"
"No, sir, that is just what I did not do.
I forced myself to forget the whole thing." "And yet you say it produced an effect upon the family?" "I can see now that it did. None of them have ever appeared quite the same as before." "Mr. Harwell," I gravely continued, "when you were questioned as to the receipt of any letter by Mr. Leavenworth which might seem in any manner to be connected with this tragedy, you denied having seen any such. How was that?" "Mr. Raymond, you are a gentleman, have a chivalrous regard for the ladies. Do you think you could have brought yourself, even if in your secret heart you considered some such result possible, which I am not ready to say I did, to mention at such a time as that the receipt of a letter complaining of the treatment received from one of Mr. Leavenworth's nieces as a suspicious circumstance worthy to be taken into account by a coroner's jury?" I shook my head. I could not but acknowledge the impossibility. "What reason had I for thinking that letter was one of importance? I knew of no Henry Ritchie Clavering." "And yet you seem to think it was. I remember you hesitated before replying." "It is true, but not as I should hesitate now, if the question were put to me again." Silence followed these words, during which I took 2 or 3 turns up and down the room. "This is all very fanciful," I remarked, laughing in the vain endeavor to throw off the superstitious horror his words had awakened. He bent his head in assent. "I know it," said he. "I am practical myself in broad daylight, and recognize the nimsiness of an accusation based upon a poor, hard-working secretary's dream as plainly as you do. This is the reason I desired to keep from speaking at all. But, Mr. Raymond," and his long, thin hand fell upon my arm with a nervous intensity which gave me almost the sensation of an electrical shock, "if the murderer of Mr. Leavenworth is ever brought to confess his deed, mark my words, he will prove to be the man of my dream." I drew a long breath. For a moment his belief was mine, and a mingled sensation of relief and exquisite pain swept over me as I thought of the possibility of Eleanore being exonerated from crime only to be plunged into fresh humiliation and deeper abysses of suffering. "He stalks the streets in freedom now," the secretary went on, as if to himself, "even dares to enter the house he has so woefully desecrated. But justice is justice, and sooner or later something will transpire which will prove to you that a premonition so wonderful as that I received had its significance; that the voice calling Truman, Truman, was something more than the empty utterances of an excited brain; that it was justice itself calling attention to the guilty." I looked at him in wonder. Did he know that the officers of justice were already upon the track of this same Clavering? I judged not from his look, but felt an inclination to make an effort and see. "You speak with strange conviction," I said, "but in all probability you are doomed to be disappointed. So far as we know, Mr. Clavering is a respectable man." He lifted his hat from the table. "I do not propose to denounce him. I do not even propose to speak his name again. I am not a fool, Mr. Raymond. I have spoken thus plainly to you only in explanation of last night's most unfortunate betrayal; and while I trust you will regard what I have told you as confidential, I also hope you will give me credit for behaving, on the whole, as well as could be expected under the circumstances." And he held out his hand. "Certainly," I replied, as I took it. Then, with a sudden impulse to test the accuracy of this story of his, inquired if he had any means of verifying his statement of having had this dream at the time spoken of, that is, before the murder, and not afterwards. "No, sir. I know myself that I had it the night previous to that of Mr. Leavenworth's death, but I cannot prove the fact." "Did not speak of it next morning to any one?" "Oh, no, sir. I was scarcely in a position to do so." "Yet it must have had a great effect upon you, unfitting you for work." "Nothing unfits me for work," was his bitter reply. "I believe you," I returned, remembering his diligence for the last few days. "But you must at least have shown some traces of having passed an uncomfortable night. Have you no recollection of any one speaking to you in regard to your appearance the next morning?" "Mr. Leavenworth may have done so. No one else would be likely to notice?" There was sadness in the tone, and my own voice softened as I said, "I shall not be at the house to night, Mr. Harwell, nor do I know when I shall return there. Personal considerations keep me from Miss Leavenworth's presence for a time, and I look to you to carry on the work we have undertaken without my assistance, unless you can bring it here." "I can do that." "I shall expect you then to morrow evening." "Very well, sir," and he was going, when a sudden thought seemed to strike him. "Sir," he said, "as we do not wish to return to this subject again, and as I have a natural curiosity in regard to this man, would you object to telling me what you know of him? You believe him to be a respectable man. Are you acquainted with him, Mr. Raymond?" "I know his name and where he resides." "And where is that?" "In London. He is an Englishman." "Ah," he murmured, with a strange intonation. "Why do you say that?" He bit his lip, and looked down, then up, finally fixed his eyes on mine, and returned, with marked emphasis, "I used an exclamation, sir, because I was startled." "Startled?" "Yes. You say he is an Englishman. Mr. Leavenworth had the most bitter antagonism to the English. It was one of his marked peculiarities. He would never be introduced to one if he could help it." It was my turn to look thoughtful. "You know," continued the secretary, "that Mr. Leavenworth was a man who carried his prejudices to the extreme. He had a hatred for the English race amounting to mania. If he had known the letter I have mentioned was from an Englishman, I doubt if he would have read it. He used to say he would sooner see a daughter of his dead before him than married to an Englishman." I turned hastily aside to hide the effect which this announcement made upon me. "You think I am exaggerating," he said. "Ask Mr. Veeley." "No," I replied, "I have no reason for thinking so." "He had doubtless some cause for hating the English with which we are unacquainted," pursued the secretary. "He spent some time in Liverpool when young, and had, of course, many opportunities for studying their manners and character." And the secretary made another movement, as if to leave. But it was my turn to detain him now. "Mr. Harwell, you must excuse me. You have been on familiar terms with Mr. Leavenworth for so long. Do you think that, in the case of one of his nieces, say, desiring to marry a gentleman of that nationality, his prejudice was sufficient to cause him to absolutely forbid the match?" "I do." I moved back. I had learned what I wished, and saw no further reason for prolonging the interview. Chapter 22. Patchwork. "Come, give us a taste of your quality." Hamlet. Starting with the assumption that Mr. Clavering in his conversation of the morning had been giving me, with more or less accuracy, a detailed account of his own experience and position regarding Eleanore Leavenworth, I asked myself what particular facts it would be necessary for me to establish in order to prove the truth of this assumption, and found them to be: 1. That Mr. Clavering had not only been in this country at the time designated, but that he had been located for some little time at a watering place in New York State. 2. That this watering place should correspond to the one in which Miss Eleanore Leavenworth was staying at the same time. 3. That they had been seen while there to hold more or less communication. 4. That they had both been absent from town, at Lorn one time, long enough to have gone through the ceremony of marriage at a point 20 miles or so away. 5. That a Methodist clergyman, who had since died, lived at that time within a radius of 20 miles of said watering place. I next asked myself how I was to establish these acts. Mr. Clavering's life was as yet too little known to me to offer me any assistance, so, leaving it for the present, I took up the thread of Eleanor's history, and found that at the time given me she had been in R, a fashionable watering place in this state. Now, if this was true, and my theory correct, he must have been there also. To prove this fact became consequently my first business. I resolved to go to R on the morrow. But before proceeding in an undertaking of such importance, I considered it expedient to make such inquiries and collect such facts as the few hours I had left to work in rendered possible. I went first to the house of Mr. Gryce. I found him lying upon a hard sofa in the bare sitting-room I have before mentioned, suffering from a severe attack of rheumatism. His hands were done up in bandages, and his feet encased in multiple folds of dingy red shawl, which looked as if it had been through the wars. Greeting me with a short nod that was both a welcome and an apology, he devoted a few words to an explanation of his unwonted position, and then, without further preliminaries, rushed into the subject which was uppermost in both our minds, by inquiring, in a slightly sarcastic way, if I was very much surprised to find my bird flown when I returned to the Hoffman house that afternoon. "I was astonished to find you allowed him to fly at this time," I replied. "From the manner in which you requested me to make his acquaintance, I supposed you considered him an important character in the tragedy which has just been enacted." "And what makes you think I don't?" "Oh, the fact that I let him go off so easily. That's no proof. I never fiddle with the brakes till the car starts downhill. But let that pass for the present. Mr. Clavering, then, did not explain himself before going?" "That is a question which I find it exceedingly difficult to answer. Hampered by circumstances, I cannot at present speak with the directness which is your due, but what I can say I will. Know, then, that in my opinion Mr. Clavering did explain himself in an interview with me this morning, but it was done in so blind a way it will be necessary for me to make a few investigations before I shall feel sufficiently sure of my ground to take you into my confidence. He has given me a possible clue." "Wait," said Mr. Gryce. "Does he know this? Was it done intentionally and with sinister motive, or unconsciously and in plain good faith?" "In good faith, I should say." Mr. Gryce remained silent for a moment. "It is very unfortunate you cannot explain yourself a little more definitely," he said at last. "I am almost afraid to trust you to make investigations, as you call them, on your own hook. You are not used to the business, and will lose time, to say nothing of running upon false scents, and using up your strength on unprofitable details. You should have thought of that when you admitted me into partnership." "And you absolutely insist upon working this mine alone?" "Mr. Gryce, the matter stands just here. Mr. Clavering, for all I know, is a gentleman of untarnished reputation. I am not even aware for what purpose you set me upon his trail. I only know that in thus following it I have come upon certain facts that seem worthy of further investigation." "Well, well, you know best. But the days are slipping by. Something must be done, and soon. The public are becoming clamorous." "I know it, and for that reason I have come to you for such assistance as you can give me at this stage of the proceedings. You are in possession of certain facts relating to this man, which it concerns me to know, or your conduct in reference to him has been purposeless. Now, frankly, will you make me master of those facts? In short, tell me all you know of Mr. Clavering, without requiring an immediate return of confidence on my part." "That is asking a great deal of a professional detective." "I know it, and under other circumstances I should hesitate long before preferring such a request, but as things are, I don't see how I am to proceed in the matter without some such concession on your part. At all events—" "Wait a moment. Is not Mr. Clavering the lover of one of the young ladies?" Anxious as I was to preserve the secret of my interest in that gentleman, I could not prevent the blush from rising to my face at the suddenness of this question. "I thought as much," he went on. "Being neither a relative nor acknowledged friend, I took it for granted he must occupy some such position as that in the family." "I do not see why you should draw such an inference," said I, anxious to determine how much he knew about him. Mr. Clavering is a stranger in town, has not even been in this country long, has indeed had no time to establish himself upon any such footing as you suggest." "This is not the only time Mr. Clavering has been in New York. He was here a year ago, to my certain knowledge." "You know that?" "Yes." "How much more do you know? Can it be possible I am groping blindly about for facts which are already in your possession? I pray you listen to my entreaties, Mr. Gryce, and acquaint me at once with what I want to know. You will not regret it. I have no selfish motive in this matter. If I succeed, the glory shall be yours. If I fail, the shame of the defeat shall be mine." "That is fair," he muttered. "And how about the reward?" "My reward will be to free an innocent woman from the imputation of crime which hangs over her." This assurance seemed to satisfy him. His voice and appearance changed. For a moment he looked quite confidential. "Well, well," said he, "and what is it you want to know?" "I should first like to know how your suspicions came to light on him at all. What reason had you for thinking a gentleman of his bearing and position was in any way connected with this affair?" "That is a question you ought not to be obliged to put," he returned. "How so?" "Simply because the opportunity of answering it was in your hands before ever it came into mine." "What do you mean?" "Don't you remember the letter mailed in your presence by Miss Mary Leavenworth during your drive from her home to that of her friend in 37th Street?" "On the afternoon of the inquest?" "Yes." "Certainly, but you never thought to look at its superscription before it was dropped into the box?" "I had neither opportunity nor right to do so." "Was it not written in your presence?" "It was." "And you never regarded the affair as worth your attention?" "However I may have regarded it, I did not see how I could prevent Miss Leavenworth from dropping a letter into a box if she chose to do so." "That is because you are a gentleman. Well, it has its disadvantages," he muttered broodingly. "But you," said I, "how came you to know anything about this letter?" "Ah, I see," remembering that the carriage in which we were riding at the time had been procured for us by him. "The man on the box was in your pay, and informed, as you call it." Mr. Gryce winked at his muffled toes mysteriously. "That is not the point," he said. "Enough that I heard that a letter, which might reasonably be proved to be of some interest to me, had been dropped at such an hour into the box on the corner of a certain street. That coinciding in the opinion of my informant, I telegraphed to the station connected with that box to take note of the address of a suspicious-looking letter about to pass through their hands on the way to the General Post Office, and, following up the telegram in person, found that a curious epistle, addressed in lead pencil and sealed with a stamp, had just arrived, the address of which I was allowed to see." "And which was?" "Henry R. Clavering, Hoffman House, New York." I drew a deep breath. "And so that is how your attention first came to be directed to this man?" "Yes." "Strange. But go on. What next?" "Why, next I followed up the clue by going to the Hoffman House and instituting inquiries. I learned that Mr. Clavering was a regular guest of the hotel, that he had come there direct from the Liverpool steamer about 3 months since, and, registering his name as Henry R. Clavering, Esquire, London, had engaged a first-class room which he had kept ever since. That although nothing definite was known concerning him, he had been seen with various highly respectable people, both of his own nation and ours, by all of whom he was treated with respect. and lastly, that while not liberal, he had given many evidences of being a man of means. So much done, I entered the office, and waited for him to come in the hope of having an opportunity to observe his manner when the clerk handed him that strange-looking letter from Mary Leavenworth. And did you succeed? No. An awkward gawk of a fellow stepped between us just at the critical moment and shut off my view. But I heard enough that evening from the clerk and servants of the agitation he had shown on receiving it to convince me I was upon a trail worth following. I accordingly put on my men, and for 2 days Mr. Clavering was subjected to the most rigid watch a man ever walked under. But nothing was gained by it. His interest in the murder, if interest at all, was a secret one, and though he walked the streets, studied the papers, and haunted the vicinity of the house in Fifth Avenue, he not only refrained from actually approaching it, but made no attempt to communicate with any of the family. Meanwhile, you crossed my path, and with your determination incited me to renewed effort. Convinced from Mr. Clavering's bearing, and the gossip I had by this time gathered in regard to him, that no one short of a gentleman and a friend could succeed in getting at the clue of his connection with this family, I handed him over to you, and found me a rather unmanageable colleague. Mr. Gryce smiled very much, as if a sour plum had been put in his mouth, but made no reply, and a momentary pause ensued. "Did you think to enquire," I asked at last, "if any one knew where Mr. Clavering had spent the evening of the murder?" "Yes, but with no good result. It was agreed that he went out during the evening, also that he was in his bed in the morning when the servant came in to make his fire. But further than that, no one seemed posted. So that, in fact, you gleaned nothing that would in any way connect this man with the murder, except his marked and agitated interest in it, and the fact that a niece of the murdered man had written a letter to him. That is all. Another question. Did you hear in what manner and at what time he procured a newspaper that evening?" "No. I only learned that he was observed by more than one to hasten out of the dining-room with the Post in his hand, and go immediately to his room without touching his dinner." That does not look. If Mr. Clavering had had a guilty knowledge of the crime, he would either have ordered dinner before opening the paper, or having ordered it, he would have eaten it. "Then you do not believe, from what you have learned, that Mr. Clavering is the guilty party?" Mr. Gryce shifted uneasily, glanced at the papers protruding from my coat pocket, and exclaimed, "I am ready to be convinced by you that he is." That sentence recalled me to the business in hand. Without appearing to notice his look, I recurred to my questions. "How came you to know that Mr. Clavering was in the city last summer? Did you learn that, too, at the Hoffman House?" "No. I ascertained that in quite another way. In short, I have had a communication from London in regard to the matter." "From London?" "Yes. I've a friend there in my own line of business, who sometimes assists me with a bit of information when requested." "But how? You have not had time to write to London and receive an answer since the murder." "It is not necessary to write. It is enough for me to telegraph him the name of a person, for him to understand that I want to know everything he can gather in a reasonable length of time about that person." "And you sent the name of Mr. Clavering to him?" "Yes, in cipher." "And have received a reply?" "This morning." I looked towards his desk. "It is not there," he said. "If you will be kind enough to feel in my breast pocket, you will find a letter." It was in my hand before he finished his sentence. "Excuse my eagerness," I said. "This kind of business is new to me, you know." He smiled indulgently at a very old and faded picture hanging on the wall before him. "Eagerness is not a fault, only the betrayal of it. But read out what you have there. Let us hear what my friend Brown has to tell us of Mr. Henry Ritchie Clavering, of Portland Place, London." I took the paper to the light, and read as follows: Henry Ritchie Clavering, gentleman, aged 43, born in Hertfordshire, England. His father was Charles Clavering, for short time in the army. Mother was Helen Ritchie, of Dumfriesshire, Scotland. She is still living. Home with H.R.C. in Portland Place, London. H.R.C. is a bachelor, 6 feet high, squarely built, weight about 12 stone, dark complexion, regular features, eyes dark brown, nose straight, called a handsome man, walks erect and rapidly. In society is considered a good fellow, rather a favourite, especially with ladies. Is liberal, not extravagant, reported to be worth about £5,000 per year, and appearances give colour to this statement. Property consists of a small estate in Hertfordshire, and some funds, amount not known. Since writing this much, a correspondent sends the following in regards to his history. In '46 went from uncle's house to Eton. From Eton went to Oxford, graduating in '56. Scholarship good. In 1855 his uncle died, and his father succeeded to the estates. Father died in '57 by a fall from his horse or a similar accident. Within a very short time H.R.C. took his mother to London, to the residence named, where they have lived to the present time. Travelled considerably in 1860, part of the time was with of Munich, also in party of Vandervorts from New York. Went as far east as Cairo, went to America in 1875 alone, but at end of 3 months returned on account of mother's illness. Nothing is known of his movements while in America. From servants learn that he was always a favourite from a boy. More recently has become somewhat taciturn. Towards last of his stay watched the post carefully, especially foreign ones. Posted scarcely anything but newspapers. Has written to Munich. Have seen from waste paper basket torn envelope directed to Amy Belden, no address. American correspondents mostly in Boston, 2 in New York, names not known, but supposed to be bankers. Brought home considerable luggage, and fitted up part of the house as for a lady. This was closed soon afterwards. Left for America 2 months since. Has been, I understand, travelling in the south. Has telegraphed twice to Portland Place. Is friends hear from him but rarely. Letters received recently, posted in New York, one by last steamer, posted in F. N.Y. Business here conducted by, in the country of, has charge of the property. Brown. The document fell from my hands. F. New York was a small town near R. "Your friend is a trump," I declared. "He tells me just what I wanted to know." And taking out my book, I made memoranda of the facts which had most forcibly struck me during my perusal of the communication before me. With the aid of what he tells me, I shall ferret out the mystery of Henry Clavering in a week, see if I do not. "And how soon," inquired Mr. Gryce, "may I expect to be allowed to take a hand in the game?" "As soon as I am reasonably assured I am upon the right track." "And what will it take to assure you of that?" "Not much. A certain point settled, and—" "Hold on. Who knows but what I can do that for you?" And looking towards the desk which stood in the corner, Mr. Gryce asked me if I would be kind enough to open the top drawer, and bring him the bits of partly burned paper I would find there. Hastily complying, I brought 3 or 4 strips of ragged paper, and laid them on the table at his side. "Another result of Fobb's researches under the coal on the first day of the inquest," Mr. Gryce abruptly explained. "You thought the key was all he found. Well, it wasn't. A second turning over of the coal brought these to light, and very interesting they are too." I immediately bent over the torn and discoloured scraps with great anxiety. There were 4 in number, and appeared at first glance to be mere remnants of a sheet of common writing paper, torn lengthwise into strips and twisted up into lighters; but upon closer inspection they showed traces of writing upon one side, and, what was more important still, the presence of 1 or more drops of spattered blood. This latter discovery was horrible to me, and so overcame me for the moment that I put the scraps down, and, turning towards Mr. Gryce, inquired, "What do you make of them?" "That is just the question I was going to put to you." Swallowing my disgust, I took them up again. "They look like the remnants of some old letter," said I. "They have that appearance," Mr. Gryce grimly assented. "A letter which, from the drop of blood observable on the written side, must have been lying face up on Mr. Leavenworth's table at the time of the murder." "Just so. And from the uniformity in width of each of these pieces, as well as their tendency to curl up when left alone, must first have been torn into even strips, and then severally rolled up before being tossed into the grate, where they were afterwards found." "That is all good," said Mr. Gryce. "Go on." "The writing, so far as discernible, is that of a cultivated gentleman. It is not that of Mr. Leavenworth, for I have studied his chirography too much lately not to know it at a glance. But it may be Hold!" I suddenly exclaimed. "Have you any mucilage handy? I think, if I could paste these strips down upon a piece of paper so that they would remain flat, I should be able to tell you what I think of them much more easily." "There is mucilage on the desk," signified Mr. Gryce. Procuring it, I proceeded to consult the scraps once more for evidence to guide me in their arrangement. These were more marked than I expected. The longer and best preserved strip, with its Mr. Haw at the top, showing itself at first blush to be the left-hand margin of the letter, while the machine-cut edge of the next in length presented tokens fully as conclusive of its being the right-hand margin of the same. Selecting these, then, I pasted them down on the piece of paper just at the distance they would occupy if the sheet from which they were torn was of the ordinary commercial note size. Immediately it became apparent, first, that it would take 2 other strips of the same width to fill up the space left between them, and secondly, that the writing did not terminate at the foot of the sheet, but was carried on to another page. Taking up the 3rd strip, I looked at its edge. It was machine-cut at the top, and showed by the arrangement of its words that it was the margin strip of a 2nd leaf. Pasting that down by itself, I scrutinized the 4th, and finding it also machine-cut at the top, but not on the side, endeavoured to fit it to the piece already pasted down, but the words would not match. Moving it along to the position it would hold if it were the 3rd strip, I fastened it down, the whole presenting, when completed, the appearance seen on the opposite page. "Well," exclaimed Mr. Gryce, "that's business." Then, as I held it up before his eyes, "But don't show it to me. Study it yourself, and tell me what you think of it." "Well," said I, "this much is certain, that it is a letter directed to Mr. Leavenworth from some house, and dated, let's see, that's an H, isn't it?" And I pointed to the one letter just discernible on the line under the word house. "I should think so, but don't ask me. It must be an H. The year is 1875, and this is not the termination of either January or February. Dated then March 1st, 1876, and signed—" Mr. Gryce rolled his eyes in anticipatory ecstasy towards the ceiling. "By Henry Clavering," I announced without hesitation. Mr. Gryce's eyes returned to his swathed finger ends. How do you know that?" "Wait a moment, and I'll show you." And taking out of my pocket the card which Mr. Clavering had handed me as an introduction at our late interview, I laid it underneath the last line of writing on the second page. One glance was sufficient. Henry Ritchie Clavering on the card, H.Chi in the same handwriting on the letter. "Clavering it is," said he, "without a doubt." But I saw he was not surprised. "And now," I continued, "for its general tenor and meaning," and, commencing at the beginning, I read aloud the words as they came, with pauses at the breaks, something as follows: "Mr. Haw, dear, a niece whom you want to who see the love and trust any other man ca beautiful so car she in face for conversation every rose has its rose is no exception Ellie as she is car tender as she is pebble of trampling one who trusted heart him to he owes a honor ants if believe her to cruel face what is bull serve yours H.Chi. It reads like a complaint against one of Mr. Leavenworth's nieces, I said, and started at my own words. "What is it?" cried Mr. Gryce. "What is the matter?" "Why," said I, "the fact is, I have heard this very letter spoken of. It is a complaint against one of Mr. Leavenworth's nieces, and it was written by Mr. Clavering." And I told him of Mr. Harwell's communication in regard to the matter. "Ah, then Mr. Harwell has been talking, has he? I thought he had forsworn gossip." "Mr. Harwell and I have seen each other almost daily for the last 2 weeks," I replied. "It would be strange if he had nothing to tell me." "And he says he has read a letter written to Mr. Leavenworth by Mr. Clavering." "Yes, but the particular words of which he has now forgotten." "These few here may assist him in recalling the rest." "I would rather not admit him to a knowledge of the existence of this piece of evidence. I don't believe in letting any one into our confidence whom we can conscientiously keep out." "I see you don't," dryly responded Mr. Gryce. Not appearing to notice the fling conveyed by these words, I took up the letter once more, and began pointing out such half-formed words in it as I thought we might venture to complete as the haw you see beautiful ha for tramplin pebble serve. This done, I next proposed the introduction of such others as seemed necessary to the sense, as Leavenworth after Horatio, Sir after dear, have, with a possible you, before a niece, Thorn after us, in the phrase Rose has its, on after trampling, whom after to, det after a, you after if, me ask after believe, beautiful after cruel. Between the columns of words thus furnished, I interposed a phrase or two here and there, the whole reading upon its completion as follows: House, March 1st, 1876. Mr. Horatio Leavenworth, dear Sir, you have a niece whom you, one, two, who seems worthy the love and trust of any other man, so beautiful, so charming is she in face, form, and conversation, but every rose has its thorn, and this rose is no exception. Lovely as she is, charming as she is, tender as she is capable of trampling on one who trusted her. Heart him to whom she owes a debt of honour nace. If you don't believe me, ask her to her cruel beautiful face. What is her humble servant yours, Henry Ritchie Clavering. I think that will do, said Mr. Gryce. Its general tenor is evident, and that is all we want at this time. The whole tone of it is anything but complimentary to the lady it mentions, I remarked. He must have had, or imagined he had, some desperate grievance to provoke him to the use of such plain language in regard to one he can still characterize as tender, charming, and beautiful. Grievances are apt to lie back of mysterious crimes. I think I know what this one was, I said, but, seeing him look up, must decline to communicate my suspicion to you for the present. My theory stands unshaken and in some degree confirmed, and that is all I can say. Then this letter does not supply the link you wanted? No, it is a valuable bit of evidence, but it is not the link I am in search of just now. Yet it must be an important clue, or Eleanor Leavenworth would not have been to such pains, first, to take it in the way she did from her uncle's table, and secondly— Wait! What makes you think this is the paper she took, or was believed to have taken from Mr. Leavenworth's table on that fatal morning? Why, the fact that it was found together with the key, which we know she dropped into the grate, and that there are drops of blood on it. I shook my head. Why do you shake your head? asked Mr. Gryce. Because I am not satisfied with your reason for believing this to be the paper taken by her from Mr. Leavenworth's table. And why? Well, first, because Fobbs does not speak of seeing any paper in her hand when she bent over the fire, leaving us to conclude that these pieces were in the scuttle of coal she threw upon it, which surely you must acknowledge to be a strange place for her to have put a paper she took such pains to gain possession of, and secondly, for the reason that these scraps were twisted as if they had been used for curl papers, or something of that kind, a fact hard to explain by your hypothesis. The detective's eye stole in the direction of my necktie, which was as near as he ever came to a face. You are a bright one, said he, a very bright one. I quite admire you, Mr. Raymond. A little surprised, and not altogether pleased with this unexpected compliment, I regarded him doubtfully for a moment, and then asked, What is your opinion upon the matter? Oh, you know I have no opinion. I gave up everything of that kind when I put the affair into your hands. Still, that the letter of which these scraps are the remnant was on Mr. Leavenworth's table at the time of the murder is believed. That upon the body being removed, a paper was taken from the table by Miss Eleanor Leavenworth is also believed. That when she found her action had been noticed, and attention called to this paper and the key, she resorted to subterfuge in order to escape the vigilance of the watch that had been set over her, and, partially succeeding in her endeavour, flung the key into the fire from which these same scraps were afterwards recovered, is also known. The conclusion I leave to your judgment. Very well, then, said I, rising. We will let conclusions go for the present. My mind must be satisfied in regard to the truth or falsity of a certain theory of mine, for my judgment to be worth much on this or any other matter connected with the affair. And, only waiting to get the address of his subordinate P, in case I should need assistance in my investigations, I left Mr. Gryce and proceeded immediately to the house of Mr. Veeley.
All right, so Mr. Raymond had a very interesting conversation with Mr. Leavenworth's personal secretary, former personal secretary. That's interesting. The dream is interesting. He's continuing to keep to the story of the dream, so fine. It's the Mr. Gryce chapter that I love. There's so much that's going on in it. But there's also fun because there's the, yes, well, you're a gentleman. And we got this in both chapters, didn't we? Gentlemen aren't going to notice these things. It has its disadvantages. I loved that. I love Detective Grice just in general. But he also talked about two things that I wanted to bring up. One is his line, eagerness is not a fault, only the betrayal of it. I love that idea that a guy like Grice would come out and say, no, 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 being eager, wanting to get to the answer, wanting to know more. That's not a fault. But denying that in yourself, telling yourself, no, 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 don't act so eager to learn. That's the fault. That's the betrayal of your own inner being. I just love that. So there was that line that I just really dug. And the other one, which I didn't bring up back when we read this chapter, but I am bringing it up now because it was referred to again. Mary Leavenworth in the carriage with Mr. Raymond takes a piece of paper from him and a pencil, writes the letter, folds it, and stamps it, and then drops it in a box. Now, we have learned today that that letter, we now know who picked the letter up. We also know that he was in a residence in a hotel when he picked it up. It was not sent collect on delivery. I mean, she said she stamped it, but I kept thinking, well, did she really stamp it? I mean, would she just have stamps on her and be able to just lick one? Did they have lick-em stamps back then? And the answer is, hoo boy, yes. She didn't have to send it collect on delivery. The Postal Service in the United States, centering inside and around New York City at first, in 1842, there was a private carrier service that came in called the City Dispatch Post. They were the ones who brought in the first adhesive postage stamps ever to be made in the Western Hemisphere. And that's how people sent stuff. And then eventually the US government came in and said, hey, you guys are great. We're going to buy you. And that's what kind of folded into the larger National Postage Service. It was going great guns. I mean, there were stamps being used all over the place. There was mail flying right, left, and center. There was no shortage of people buying and using stamps. And that's in 1847. So by 1880, it was like, yeah, been there, done that. There was nothing new, different, unique, anything about having a stamp that had an adhesive back on it that you would lick and affix to an envelope or a folded piece of paper that you wanted to send. That's it. It was definitely an ain't no thing moment. But I had wondered, and so I thought I would share what I found out with you. And with that, I am done for the week. I couldn't go do any more research. I couldn't go listen to any other voicemails, but next week I will be able to. So when you call and tell me about rheumatism and rheumatoid arthritis, 206-350-1642, then I will be able to pick up the voicemail and share it with everyone. All right, have a great week. I will talk to you soon. I hope you enjoyed today's chapters. I did. And be well. Take care of each other. Wear a mask. Get a vaccine. Be safe. Talk to you later. Bye. If you like what you hear on Craftlit, please review us on iTunes, like us on Facebook, join in the fun in our Facebook group, which is Craftlit Annotated Audiobooks. Always the nicest group of people you're going to find on Facebook, and the place where you can come to and say, nobody else was going to understand this, but I knew you all would. And of course, thank you for your support of Craftlit. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.